Hey everyone, how's it going? We're going to be starting our last module this week, and the first thing that I want to get into is talking about terrestrial biomes. And so we're going to look at 8 different terrestrial biomes here. The ones that we're going to focus on are first the tropical rainforests, then we'll get into the savannas, then we'll talk about the subtropical deserts, we'll get into something called the chaparral, we'll talk about the temperate grasslands, the temperate forests, the boreal forests, and the Arctic tundra. And so when we talk about biomes, biomes are large-scale environments that are distinguished by characteristic temperature ranges and amounts of precipitation. Um, these two variables will affect the types of vegetation and the animal life that can exist in those areas. Since each biome is defined by its climate, the same biome can occur geographically in distinct areas that have similar climates. So if you take a look, just at the first one we'll look at is the tropical forests. You'll find them in South America, you'll find them in Africa, and you'll find them in parts of Australia. And so you see that there are many different places where you'll find the same biome, and it's because the biome is constrained by the climate that you experience. Let's take a look at this graph right here. On this graph, we have average annual temperature on the x-axis and average annual precipitation on the y-axis. So here's temperature and here's precipitation. So the way that the biomes are plotted on this graph has the wettest and the hottest biome, tropical rainforest, up here, and the coldest and the driest, the tundra, down here. And so anywhere in between, as you increase here on the x-axis, you'd see average annual temperature going up and the average annual precipitation going up here. So this is just a good example just to plot the different biomes and see where they how they compare climate-wise to each other. The wettest and the hottest biome is the tropical rainforest, and it's the first one that we're going to talk about today. So tropical rainforests are found near the equatorial regions. The equator, if you're unaware, it receives almost direct sunlight. So the sunlight comes at basically a 90-degree angle. This leads to high temperatures that we'll talk about in just a second. So tropical rainforests have 4 main characteristics that I'd like to talk to you about. The first is that it has very high annual rainfall. They have, like we just said, high average temperatures. They have nutrient-poor soil, and they have high levels of biodiversity or species richness. And basically what that means is you find a lot of species there. So if we talk about rainfall, the word rainforest implies that these are some of the world's wettest ecosystems. Rainforests generally receive very high rainfall each year, although the exact amount varies among different years and different rainforests. One example is South America's tropical rainforests receive between 80 and 120 inches, or 6.5 to 10 feet of rain in a typical year, which is just incredible to think about. Tropical rainforests also have high humidity, about 88% during the wet season, approximately 77% in the dry season. And really, there's relatively few changes seen due to seasonality. That is to say, tropical rainforests don't really experience seasonal changes in rainfall or temperature like we might be used to here. It's pretty similar across the entire year. Tropical rainforests are found near the equator, between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. The equator receives direct sunlight, and so what you'll basically see is that you get this steady flow of radiation, sunlight, which produces consistently high temperatures throughout the year. A typical daytime temperature any time of the year in tropical rainforests is like 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Although temperatures can be much higher than that, but just averaged out throughout the year, it's like 85 degrees Fahrenheit. In the majority of tropical rainforests, there's only a 9 degrees Fahrenheit difference in temperature between the seasons. And so basically, you're never getting really cold temperatures. It's always pretty much very warm. It's also extremely humid, and so if you've ever walked out of your house on a hot and humid day and you might have sweat through a shirt, you know that shirt just stays wet because when the air is humid, no more moisture can evaporate into the air. And so when things are wet, they tend to stay wet. Since there's a tremendous amount of diversity of foliage and in tropical rainforests, you might assume that rainforest soils are rich in nutrients, but in fact, rainforest soils are nutrient poor because the nutrients are not stored in them for very long. The heavy rains that occur in rainforests will wash the organic material from the soil. Although decomposition occurs rapidly in the hot and moist conditions, many of the dead fallen leaves and other organic detritus are swept away from these heavy rains before they can release all of their nutrients. In addition, the sheer amount of vegetation that lives within these biomes makes it so that the nutrients that are returned to the soil by the decomposers are taken quickly by the plants instead of being stored in the soil. Since decomposition happens so fast, you get what is called topsoil, which is quite literally the top layer of soil that is very nutrient rich and supports all of this diverse life that we see in terms of plant growth. And so the soils itself don't have a lot of nutrients, but you see all that plant life, they take it up very quickly and they store it within their bodies. So tropical rainforests are areas of extremely high biodiversity compared to other ecosystems. In the tropical rainforests of Borneo, for example, scientists have documented more than 15,000 plant species, including 2,500 species of orchids alone. Biologists estimate that tropical rainforests contain about 50% of the world's terrestrial plant and animal species, yet they encompass only about 6% of the world's land area. So let's just say that again. 50% of the world's plant and animals live in a 6% land area. So, while tropical rainforests around the world have many similarities in their climates and soil composition, each regional forest is unique. You will not find precisely the same species living in all the tropical rainforests around the world. However, the different species play similar roles within their specific regional forests. Just wanted to point out these are some of those orchids in Borneo. And I really just put this on here because I think they're really beautiful. And just think about 2,500 different species of orchids in one rainforest. So when we think about some of the iconic examples of tropical rainforest animals, we can think of the primates. The diversity between different regional tropical rainforests is pretty impressive. Primates, again, are groups of animals that include humans like us, great apes, and the monkeys. Central and South America have the howler monkeys right here, the spider monkeys, the capuchin, the squirrel monkeys, while Africa will have vervets, they'll have baboons, chimpanzees, and gorillas. So Madagascar actually has a tropical rainforest, and they have a unique primate called lemur. I'm sure you guys have seen lemurs before. And Asia has proboscis monkeys, macaw monkeys, langurs, gibbons, and orangutans. So what this means is that saving one rainforest won't save all of the diversity that's represented by rainforests around the world. And really, we have to think about the human impacts that we have on the rainforest biome. There's a tremendous human pressure on rainforests all around the world because of slash and burn agriculture. So here's slash and burn agriculture and mining and unsustainable timber harvesting. So the development of roads and cities. So what I'd like for you to take away from this is that if we just save one of the rainforests, we won't be doing our job. We'll be losing a tremendous amount of biodiversity. And so really, we have to take steps to preserve all of the rainforests. Tropical rainforests, they harbor 50% of the world's biodiversity, right? We just talked about 50% of the world's biodiversity. The massive deforestation of the forests have caused the total land mass to go from 15 million kilometers squared to about 8 million kilometers squared. And that's, nearly half. It's estimated that nearly 2% of the rainforest is lost every year. Continuing on, approximately 137 species are lost in this biome per day, including both species of plants, animals, and insects. Now, that's an approximation that we make based on a number of mathematical models. Remember, there are species in these forests that we haven't even discovered yet, and that's for sure. We discover new species every year in these forests. And when you cut down and burn all of the trees and all of the land that they could live on, you are definitely leading to extinction of these species. And so it's really really tough to see, but there are steps being taken by certain agencies to protect this land and protect this biome. So let's move on to the next one, the savannas. So when we talk about savannas, a savanna is a rolling grassland that's scattered with shrubs and isolated trees, which can be found between tropical rainforests and the desert biome. So not enough rain really falls on the savanna to support forests, but it does get more rain than a desert would have. Um, Savannas are sometimes also called tropical grasslands, but for this class we'll call them savannas. So savannas are found on they're in a wide band on either side of the equator on the edges of the tropical rainforest. So it's in this tan color here, or maybe I guess you call it tan. And here they are. You can see they're between tropical rainforests and deserts. You'll find them. So this is a big example right here in Africa, down here and right here. So what you'll see is tropical rainforest, savanna, and desert, and that's really what you see anywhere you look here. Savannas have a warm temperature year-round. There are actually two very different seasons in a savanna, though. We'll get a very long dry season, and where you only get an average about 4 inches of rainfalls, and then you'll get a very, very wet season in the summer. Between December and February, no rain will fall at all. But oddly enough, it is actually a little cooler during this dry season. But don't expect to wear a sweater. It's still around 70 degrees Fahrenheit. In the summer, there's a lot of rain. In Africa, they have what are called monsoon seasons, and monsoons begin in May, and you'll get an average of 15 to 25 inches of rain during this time. It gets hot and very humid during the rainy season, and each day the hot, humid air rises off the ground and collides with cooler air above, and you just get this constant cycle of rain. In the afternoons on the summer savanna, the rain pour can literally last for hours. And if you take a look, these are the exact same place taken between the dry season and the wet season. You can see how drastically different the savanna is depending on the season. And so what you get is a lot of migration of animals that know when to be here when there's wet water and vegetation to eat, and when not to be there when it's basically a desert. African savannas, here we're looking at the savanna in Africa, they have large herds of grazing hoofed animals. Each animal is going to have a specialized eating habit that reduces competition for food. So they'll either eat a different part of a plant or a different plant altogether. There's several types of savannas around the world, and the ones that we're most familiar with are going to be the East African savannas that are covered with these trees, and these trees are called acacia trees, a very distinct shape with their flat tops. They are the Serengeti Plains of Tanzania are some of the most well known. Here you have animals like zebras, elephants, and giraffes, and many types of other ungulates. And ungulates are just animals that have hooves that will graze and hunt. Many large grass-eating animals can survive here because they can move around and eat all of the grass. And in turn, there's a lot of carnivores who can eat them. Here's some examples. So when we talk about when we talk about the carnivores that take down, we get things like leopards and cheetahs and jackals and lions and hyenas, and they can take down. There's about 40 different species of hoofed animals that live on the savannas of Africa, and so they have a really good food selection here, and really it's just interesting to think about the number of animals that are supported on a relatively simple biome like the savanna. Okay, so the next one I want to talk about are the subtropical deserts. A subtropical desert is a type of biome that is characterized by high temperatures, very low precipitation, right? It's a desert, that makes sense, and warm soils. Examples of these type of deserts are the Mojave Desert, the Sonoran Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, Sahara Desert, and the Great Victoria Desert. This biome exists between 15 and 30 degrees north and south latitude. It's centered on the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn. So you take a look at the deserts here. Here they are up here and down below. So Tropic of Cancer and Tropic of Capricorn. Um, Deserts are frequently located on the downwind side of mountain ranges, which creates a rain shadow, or basically what happens is on the upwind side, the rain falls, and on the downwind side, there's no rain. And so when you get a lack of rain, you get deserts. This is typical of the North American deserts, such as the Mojave or the Sonoran deserts, or deserts in other regions, such as the Sahara Desert in northern Africa, or the Namib Desert in southwestern Africa, are dry because of the high pressure dry air that descends on those latitudes. So when we look at subtropical deserts, they're very dry. Evaporation typically exceeds precipitation. So basically, the rain that falls is less than the amount of evaporation that's taken away by evaporation. Um, so subtropical deserts can have daytime soil temperatures that are above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And the interesting thing is they can have nighttime temperatures that are approaching or below freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit. And so you get really extreme temperature differences just from day to night. Subtropical deserts are characterized by, of course, low annual precipitation of less than 12 inches in a year, with little monthly variation, meaning there's really no wet or dry season, and there's a real lack of predictability in rainfall. Some years you might receive a tiny amount of rainfall, and sometimes you might receive more. On average, though, it's pretty low. In some cases, the annual rainfall can be as low as zero point 0.8 of an inch. In subtropical deserts located near Australia, like the outback, you're not seeing any rain at all. So there's really that results in a low species diversity compared to the other biomes we've talked about so far, where really you get only a specific few number of individual species that are really well adapted to living in this extremely dry, unpredictable conditions. Um, Despite the relatively low diversity, though, desert species exhibit fascinating adaptations to the harshness of their environment. Very dry deserts will lack perennial vegetation. Perennial vegetation is vegetation that lives from one year to the next. Instead, what you find is that many plants are annuals, so they'll grow quickly, they'll reproduce when rainfall does occur, and then they die. Perennial plants in deserts are characterized by adaptations that will conserve water, right? That makes sense. They'll have deep roots, reduced foliage, so really not a lot of leaves, and water storing stems. Like, look at this cactus. He's going to store all of this water within him, and he's going to not really have these big leafy growths on him. Seed plants in the desert will produce seeds that can lie dormant for extended periods of time between rains. And most animal life in the deserts has adapted to a nocturnal life where they can spend the hot daytime hours beneath ground. The Namib Desert is the oldest desert on the planet, and it's probably been dry for more than 55 million years. But it supports a number of endemic species. Endemic species means species that are found only in that area because of that. So, for example, the unusual plant or tree that's called Welwitschia mirabilis, but people just call it Welwitschia. It's the only extant, which means living, species of an entire order of plants. So everything that was in the order of Welwitschia, there's only one species that still remains, and it's Welwitschia mirabilis in the Namib Desert. And there's also 5 species of reptiles that are considered endemic to Namib. So it's really interesting to see how organisms will adapt to these really extreme conditions that there's no way we would be able to survive in, but they do quite well. So in addition to those subtropical deserts, there's also cold deserts, and these are kind of the same idea, except they are actually much more cold than they are hot. Um, Cold deserts experience freezing temperatures during the winter, and any precipitation that they get is in the form of snowfall. And so snowfall really is not useful to organisms because you can't drink or eat, really, you can't utilize the water in snowfall. The largest of these cold deserts is the Gobi Desert in northern China and in southern Mongolia. Uh, there's also the Taklamakan Desert in western China and the Turkestan Desert and the Great Basin Desert in our United States are all considered cold deserts. So I don't know. I just wanted to put that in there just because I think when we tend to think of deserts, we think of really hot, dry places. And these are really dry places, but they're also cold. The next one I want to talk about is the chaparral. Sometimes you'll hear the chaparral called the scrub forest, and this is found in California and along the Mediterranean Sea, along the southern coast of Australia. What you'll find here is that the annual rainfall in this biome is anywhere from 25.6 to 30 inches, and the majority of the rain falls in the winter. What you'll find is that summers are very, very dry, and what you'll find is that many of the chaparral plants are dormant during the summertime. The vegetation here is dominated by shrubs and is adapted to periodic fires, with some plants that produce seeds that only germinate after a fire has occurred. The ashes that are left behind after a fire are going to be rich in nutrients like nitrogen, and it basically will fertilize the soil. And so it's interesting to think that the fire is actually needed for some of these plants to continue their life cycle. Now, you think about California and the wildfires that occur there, and it's actually natural for that to happen. The problem is when we have is when we build human living structures or roads near these natural fires, that causes us some issues. And what happens is it gets worse because we practice what is called fire suppression, so that when a fire does happen, it's actually even worse than it normally would be if we just let them occur more rapidly. So here's where the chaparral is, right in this blue color, right here in terms of California, over in the northern parts of Africa, and down here you'll find them in Australia. And so where you see these, this is where wildfires are going to be very, very common. Okay, so the next one is the temperate grasslands. Temperate grasslands are found throughout central North America, and you'll hear these called prairies before. Okay, here's the little house in the prairie, right? And in Eurasia, they'll call them steppes. But the temperate grasslands are sort of the overall accepted term in biology. They have pronounced annual fluctuation in temperatures, hot summers, cold winters. If you have ever been to anywhere in the Midwest, you know how the summer is really, really hot, the winter is really, really cold. The annual temperature variation produces specific growing seasons for plants, right? We're pretty familiar with seasons like this. Plant growth is possible when temperatures are warm, and that occurs in the spring and summer, and that they sort of fall off in the fall, and then they'll be dormant in the winter. Annual precipitation ranges from 10 to 35 inches. They'll have few trees, right? It's a grassland. They'll have few trees, except if you find them growing along rivers or streams. The dominant vegetation tends to, big surprise, consist of grasses. The treeless condition is maintained by low precipitation, frequent fires, and grazing by, well, what we used to have were our big herds of buffalo. Unfortunately, we hunted those down in the early years of America, but people still do have buffalo herds and cattle herds that will continue to graze the grasslands. The vegetation does get very dense, and the soils are fertile because the subsurface of the soil is packed with the roots and the rhizomes, which are just underground stems of these grasses. The roots and rhizomes act to anchor the plants into the ground, and when those plants die, they replenish the organic material in the soil. And so basically you just get this this grassland that continues to cycle upon itself, where it can't really support any large trees unless you are by the river, and you get basically this proliferation of grass species. So taking a look at temperate grasslands, we've got a bunch of those in America, well, the United States of America, and you'll find them up in Canada as well, up here as well, and really they're a northern hemisphere dominated biome. Okay, so the next one is the temperate forests. This is the most common biome in eastern North America. This is basically where we live. You'll find them in Western Europe, Eastern Asia, in Chile, and New Zealand. This biome is found throughout the mid-latitude regions. Temperatures range anywhere from as cold as negative 22 degrees Fahrenheit to as high as 86 degrees Fahrenheit on average. We know that we can get hotter days than that during the summer. Um, but what you'll see is that you drop to below freezing on an annual basis, right? There's an annual winter season where it gets to frozen temperatures. These temperatures mean that temperate forests have defined growing seasons during the spring, summer, and fall. Precipitation is relatively constant through the year and ranges anywhere between 30 to 60 inches of rain. Deciduous trees meaning trees that have cycles of leaves, right? They grow leaves in the early spring and they lose them in the fall, are the dominant plant in this biome. There's very few evergreen conifers, right? We do see some, but the main dominant are the deciduous trees. Deciduous trees, like I said, they lose their leaves each fall and they remain leafless in the winter, which means that little photosynthesis can occur during the winter period, where each spring new leaves appear as the temperature increases. Because of this dormant period, the net primary productivity of temperate forests is less than that of tropical forests. And basically that just means that the amount of plant production from photosynthesis is less because, well, there's a whole bunch of the year when they can't do that at all. The soils of the temperate forests are going to be rich in inorganic and organic nutrients compared to our tropical rainforests. That's because of this thick layer of leaf litter that we get on the forest floors. And you don't get that many rains, and so what happens is those dead leaves break down and they just sort of stay in the soil. As this leaf litter decays, it returns the nutrients to the soil. The leaf litter also protects soil from erosion, insulates the ground, and provides habitats for invertebrates like insects and their predators like mice and snakes and other things. So pretty interesting here. Let's take a look where these guys are. The temperate forest is this sort of orange color here, and you can see this is very evident in towards eastern North America, right where we are at, is basically all temperate forests. All right, boreal forests. This boreal forest, also known as taiga or coniferous forest, is found roughly between 50 degrees and 60 degrees north latitude, which means most of Canada, Alaska, Russia, and northern Europe. Basically, they're found above a certain elevation and below higher elevations where trees cannot grow. You'll find them in mountain ranges throughout the northern hemisphere. It's a cold, dry biome that has short, very long winters and short, cool, and wet summers. The annual precipitation is anywhere between 16 and 40 inches, and it usually takes the form of snow. What you'll find is that relatively little evaporation occurs because really it's just cold all the time. What you'll find is that the long and cold winters in the boreal forest have led to the predominance of cold-tolerant, cone-bearing plants, the coniferous trees. These are the evergreen trees like pine, spruce, and fir, which they'll have their needle-shaped leaves year-round. Evergreen trees can photosynthesize earlier in the spring than deciduous trees can because less energy is required from the sun to warm a needle leaf like that they have instead of a broad leaf like a deciduous tree has. The boreal forest shelters more than 85 species of mammals, including some of the largest and most majestic. Wood bison, elk, moose, woodland caribou, grizzly bears, black bears, wolves. You'll find smaller species such as beavers, snowshoe hares, Canada lynx, red squirrels, lemmings, voles. This is a crossbill bird. And so really there's a lot of interesting animals up there. Certainly not as diverse as our more equatorial biomes, but there's a lot of stuff that lives up there in the cold boreal forests. And the last one I want to talk about is the Arctic tundra. The Arctic tundra lies north of the subarctic boreal forest, so it's even farther north, and it's located throughout the Arctic regions of the northern hemisphere. Tundras also exist at elevations above the tree line, so basically you could be so high up that trees can't live up there. The average winter temperature is negative 30 degrees Fahrenheit, and here's the average summer temperature, which is 37 to 52 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's cold all the time. Plants in the Arctic tundra have a short growing season of approximately 50 to 60 days, right? A little less than 2 months sometimes. However, during this time, there are almost 24 hours of daylight. Think about Alaska. There's months at a time where the sun never sets. Um, and so during that time, plant growth is pretty rapid because the sun is always out. The annual precipitation is low, believe it or not, with only 6 to 10 inches. And really, if it does happen at all, it's all going to be snow. There's little evaporation as well, so the snow will just kind of stay there for extended periods of time just because it's always cold. Plants in the Arctic tundra are generally very low to the ground and include things like shrubs, grasses, lichens, and very small flowering plants. There is little species diversity, right? There's not going to be a lot of organisms that can survive up here, and so the ones that do sort of dominate. And there's really a low above ground biomass. You can see here there's pretty much rocks, some small grasses, some lichens, and that's about it. The soils of the tundra may remain in a perennially frozen state, which is called permafrost. The permafrost basically makes it impossible for roots to penetrate far into the soil, and it'll slow the decay of dead organic matter, which inhibits, obviously, the release of nutrients back to the ground, back to the soil. The melting of the permafrost in brief summer provides water for a burst of productivity, while the temperatures and the long days might permit it. So during this growing season, the ground of the Arctic tundra can be completely covered in more green plants and lichens, but very quickly they will die off because it's about to get very, very cold. Here are just some of the organisms that still survive in places like the tundra. So you might be surprised to see that a place that is seemingly as barren as a tundra can support organisms, mammals as big as this polar bear, and this snow fox, and this snow hare, and this caribou, and this is a vole. And so just thinking about even in places that you might consider the most barren, still support very interesting and diverse large mammals. So the last thing I want to point out is both the boreal forest, which is up here in the far north, and then even farther north is the tundra. And with that, I'm going to call it. So that was our first introduction to terrestrial biomes. On Wednesday, we will talk about the aquatic biomes.